Good morning. I'm Brad DeLong, and this is my morning coffee. I'm going to try to be fair, balanced, and reality-based throughout this presentation. Today I want to talk about American income inequality, what's happened to it over the past generation. You see, back in the 1980s, it seemed as though America was still a largely social democratic country. The top 1% of the income distribution had about 9% of national income, down from about 17% in the bad old days back before the Great Depression, the era of the Gilded Age. Then, in the late 1970s, estimates of income inequality began to climb sharply. They climbed most sharply in 1987 and in 1988. Now, economists weren't greatly worried about the climb in income inequality in 1980 to keep your money locked up without realizing your capital gains. Economists thought that the Tax Reform Act of 1986 would be followed by a big upward spike in apparent income, at least as reported by the IRS, as people realized their capital gains, and then thereafter income inequality would drop back down to something like normal after this temporary spike. But that's not what happened. Instead of falling after 1988, income inequality remained about the same for the next several years. And by the early 1990s, economists were thinking that there had been a permanent upward shift in the extent to which the American economy delivered more unequal rewards as it stood in the early 1990s than it had delivered in the great post-World War II period up until the mid-1980s. This seemed, to those of us working for the Clinton administration, to be good reason to shift to a more progressive income tax system. That after all, if the market is producing more unequal rewards, then the government should take steps to squeeze rewards back together, to provide some social insurance. Then, in the late 1990s, a second thing happened. We had the Industrial Revolution in computers and communications, the high-tech boom, the explosion of wealth in Silicon Valley. And income inequality began to rise sharply once again, reaching a peak at the very end of the decade. Now, this sharp rise in income inequality was accompanied by very strong economic growth and by gratifyingly strong increases in wages and salaries at all points in the income distribution. A rising tide truly was lifting all boats, albeit lifting the biggest boats more, proportionately, and much, much more absolutely. The early 2000s saw yet another change. Incomes stagnated. Incomes at the very top, in fact, fell significantly during the recession of the early 1990s, or the early 2000s, but then returned to their previous trend, with income inequality rising extremely sharply in 2004, and even more sharply in 2005. By 2005, income inequality had surpassed its high-tech bubble 2000 peak, and had done so without the excuse of an overvalued stock market, while incomes for the bottom 99% of Americans had been more or less stagnant since the very start of the decade. The end result of all of this has been to carry us back to levels of income inequality characteristic of the Gilded Age. We are now, it looks, as unequal a country as we were then. And this is too bad. To the extent that you think that America in the middle of the 20th century had something good going for it,